Give Margarita Montemore her flowers. This book was so good. I had such a fun time. Wow, what an amazing take on time travel. I'm so impressed. Welcome back to the madness. My name is Aaron, and today we're staring into the abyss, and staring back at us is Oona Out of Order by Margarita Montemore. This is a really fun piece of time travel speculative fiction in which our main protagonist lives her life quite literally out of order. I think I would sell my soul to have this novel be so much longer because I do desperately want to see every year. I know why we don't. I know why we don't get every single year. I just want the record to show that I want it. It's just something I want. So speculative literature is the umbrella term that encompasses any genre that engages in the what-ifs of improbable or impossible storytelling, science fiction, fantasy, paranormal, and dystopia, among many others. In our case with Oona Out of Order, we're in the world of science fiction. Most of you already know what science fiction is, but for those who are fresh as a daisy, science fiction is when we tell stories with advances in technology and science, usually set in the future. A lot of science fiction deals with outer space or other planets, and in our case, time travel. I do love time travel as a plot device. It's a staple in my Dungeons & Dragons games when I'm the Dungeon Master. The typical structure of a time travel narrative is that, like, a character has the chance to go back and they change the past, they change it, and then the future is bizarre and incorrect, and then they have to rush to return to the present the way that it was. One of the most enjoyable parts of this sort of basic structure is seeing the uncanny future and what about it upsets the protagonist. The theme usually explored here is something along the lines of you don't know what you have until it's gone, or better the devil you know rather than the devil you don't. One of the most famous examples in modern time travel storytelling is the video game Life is Strange, a game I both love and hate. I love it because it's interesting, but I hate it because it's a choice-based game with the illusion of choice. None of your choices matter in that game. I appreciate the novelty of the main character, Max, not being thrust into like an uncanny future, but instead watches in real time as reality begins to break apart due to her interference, resulting in that like ultimate choice of does she go back and reset the timeline, or does she keep moving forward while reality is ripping itself apart. Time travel forces us to engage with philosophy. That's right, lords and germs, it's time to talk about fate. While there is a gradient of ideologies between the two extremes, on one side we have the idea that everything is predetermined and we can't do anything to change that path, and on the other side it states that nothing is determined and everything is left up to random chance, also known as free will or libertarianism. We have to make a decision about fate and chance when we start engaging with time travel. Can we make an impact by changing our future, or is everything set in stone? As we can see from the typical structure of a time travel plot, we do see that it tends to lean towards randomness more than fate. That's how we get the uncanny and unrecognizable future our protagonist is desperate to remedy. However, that doesn't make predetermination impossible. Life is Strange, as previously mentioned, despite being an exploration of chaos theory, is a game that leads towards predetermination because we cannot save one particular character in the cast without the storm that destroys the city. So fate really is saying that this girl is meant to die, and all of Max's attempts to ensure that she doesn't die is what's causing the storm, which means that no matter what, this girl has to die, and there's no reason to believe the storm is going to stop until she does die. She's been determined to die, and nothing can change that. Honestly, we see the world confirmed as predetermined more famously in Hellenism, ancient Greek polytheism. Many Greek heroes get prophecies they cannot escape from. Oedipus Rex is the most famous example of a man fated to kill his father and marry his mother. His father sends Oedipus away to avoid this, but Oedipus ends up doing exactly that because he didn't know the man he killed was his father, so he also didn't know the woman he married was his mother. The Greeks say you can't fight fate. Sorry, not sorry. Predeterminism is more common when our temporal stories are about going forward into the future, and the chaotic randomness of free will is more common when our temporal stories are about going back towards the past. So that's philosophy. But what about science? When I started this podcast, I did not think I would be talking about science as much, but here we are. So chaos theory, better known as the butterfly effect, is about the impact of minor variations in the conditions of two systems that can cause drastic differences later down the line. This is like playing a video game with multiple endings. Each playthrough is a different system, with the different choices you make drastically changing the outcome. And I don't even mean just the ending you get, whether you get the good ending or the bad ending. But the entire playing experience will be different if you choose like a different class or pick a different route to explore the map. I love chaos theory. Alternate realities are a canon thing in like the D&D world I run, and every now and then my players will encounter these realities where like there are timelines where things aren't that much different, and then there are worlds that are completely unrecognizable. One of my players in the current game I'm running is a timeline collapser in most other timelines, and we just happen to be in one of the few timelines where he had a positive intervention and has no need to collapse timelines as a result. It's great. But you want to know what's just as cool as chaos theory? Laplace's demon. So if chaos theory is science-flavored free will, Laplace's demon is science-flavored predeterminism. It's important to note that Laplace's demon is more like a scientific thought experiment that doesn't quite hold up to scientific scrutiny, but it's an interesting way to conceptualize a scientific understanding of predeterminism and predicting the future. So this thought experiment basically says if there was a creature who could perfectly know where every molecule is and where they would end up and how they would end up there, this creature would effectively be able to tell the future since it knows where every atom will go at any place in time, and this creature is called Laplace's demon, Laplace being the guy who sort of created this concept. While it is aimed at trying to prove predeterminism, what I find most interesting about Laplace's demon is that it's an explanation on how to tell the future with scientific language, and that's why I'm bringing it up in this podcast. Chaos theory and Laplace's demon contradict each other since chaos theory relies on an imperfect system with slight variations, and Laplace's demon is supposed to be a perfect system. Laplace's demon knows where everything ends up. There's no variance. The fun part of science fiction is that you don't really need to be an expert in science. You just need to know enough about something to be able to take it and extrapolate on it. Obviously, in the real world, Laplace's demon doesn't necessarily work. I believe that the laws of thermodynamics contradict it because there are irreversible processes, and if you can't work back, like irreversible processes are ones where you can't look at the result and work back to the beginning. And I believe that contradicts with Laplace's demon. I am not an expert, so a scientist could weigh in and explain it to my little dumb brain, but that's what I understand, is that irreversible processes make it impossible for Laplace's demon. That's why Laplace's demon doesn't really stand to scrutiny. That was a lot of me rambling to try to formulate a sentence. I am so sorry. This is why I can't go off script. I can't formulate a sentence when I go off script. I just think it's really cool that science could explain a way to tell the future. Like, that's the cool part. And if you're doing science fiction, you can take that and extrapolate on it. This won't be the last time we talk about time travel here. I also do want to cover Here and Now and Then, which is another time travel novel that I read this year. And we'll cover some other aspects of time travel then. When we talked about I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hoffman, we discussed a writing technique called writing around the answer. As a writer, we need to know the answer to every question we pose in the book, even if we never plan on telling the reader. By knowing the answer, we can write around the answer. It's sort of like drawing in the negative space. The picture is formed by what isn't drawn instead of what is. This is also about the cell. An author might not actually pick the answer, but the writing is strong enough to suggest that they did, and that's all that matters. So long as the audience feels like the clues left behind points to an actual answer, we're golden. It can be really disorienting when it's clear the author didn't really make any decisions and was just like, it's up for interpretation. And it's like, yeah, but you didn't really give us anything to interpret, did you? Some time travel stories confirm without a shadow of a doubt whether their story is on the line between predeterminism and libertarianism being free will. I asked my boyfriend, who studied philosophy in college, because I was like, what do you call the opposite of predeterminism? And he was like, libertarianism and just free will is the closest word. So those are the words we're using. Oona Out of Order does have a lot of evidence that points to one particular answer, but I can see someone formulating arguments for other options. Maybe it's one of you in the audience that thinks that, it's the other way than what the book kind of presents. I don't know. I'd love to hear what you think if you've also read this book. That's the bell. You can put your notebooks away because it's time to move forward from science and technology and move into the synopsis. A remarkably inventive novel that explores what it means to live a life fully in the moment, even if those moments are out of order. It's New Year's Eve, 1982, and Oona Lockhart has her whole life before her. At the stroke of midnight, she will turn 19, and the year ahead promises to be one of consequence. Should she go to London to study economics or remain at home in Brooklyn to pursue her passion for music and be with her boyfriend? As the countdown to the new year begins, Oona faints and awakens 32 years into the future in her 51-year-old body. Greeted by a friendly stranger in a beautiful house she's told is her own, Oona learns that with each passing year she will leap to another age at random, and so begins Oona Out of Order. Hopping through decades, pop culture fads, and much-needed stock tips, Oona is still a young woman on the inside, but ever-changing on the outside. Who will she be next year? Philanthropist, club kid, world traveler, wife to a man she's never met? Surprising, magical, and heart-wrenching, Marguerite Montemor has created an unforgettable story about the burdens of time, the endurance of love, and the power of family. And this synopsis is right. It is correct. This is all of those things. There's still a lot going on in here, so let's break this down section by section. A remarkably inventive novel that explores what it means to live a life fully in the moment, even if those moments are out of order. So as far as a hook line goes, this is just okay. We've definitely heard better on this podcast. I think the reason this hook line is struggling a little bit because it's got a vanity line in it. Vanity lines are not a bad thing. These are just like the lines in the synopsis that hype up the book. In this case, the vanity line is saying that the book is remarkably inventive. When we're writing a synopsis, we want to hype it up, but we usually wait until the end to throw in the vanity line. Now, art is subjective, so of course, if you think this book is remarkably inventive or not is entirely up to you. However, I do think this book is remarkably inventive, so you will not be disappointed. This book is great. We also get our first hint into the premise, which is the idea of living your life in the moment, but out of order. This also connects to the themes. An embrace of the temporary when you understand that all things come to an end, which is one of the fundamental tenets of Buddhism. That's not important, I just want to share a fun fact. Let's keep going. It's New Year's Eve, 1982, and Oona Lockhart has her whole life before her. At the stroke of midnight, she will turn 19, and the year ahead promises to be one of consequence. Should she go to London to study economics or remain at home in Brooklyn to pursue her passion for music and be with her boyfriend? At the countdown to the new year begins, Oona faints and awakens 32 years in the future in her 51-year-old body. Greeted by a friendly stranger in a beautiful house she is told is her own, Oona learns that with each passing year she will leap to another age at random, and so begins Oona Out of Order. The fascinating thing about this section is something we saw with I Who Have Never Known Men, in which we know how the first plot point is going to go down. We know that the New Year's Eve party is going to go awry. This is called dramatic irony, where the reader knows something the characters don't. We've also got some promise lines here about plot, like friendly stranger, the big house, the fact that Oona leaps from different ages at random. We kind of understand how the time travel works right out the gate. All of these promises are met in the story, so that's good. Right now, we're fairly on point for what this synopsis is selling us. Hopping through decades, pop culture fads, and much-needed stock tips, Oona is still a young woman on the inside, but ever-changing on the outside. Who will she be next year? Philanthropist, club kid, world traveler, wife to a man she's never met? Surprising, magical, and heart-wrenching, Marguerite Montemor has crafted an unforgettable story about the burdens of time, the endurance of love, and the power of family. So here we have some more promises of plot. Though all of the suggested paths are posed as questions, these are hints to the different lives that Oona will lead throughout the years. Club Kid was the only one that confused me. Club Kids was a group in NYC during the 1980s and 1990s, which composed of young people who were into partying, fashion, music, and was also a very queer-friendly space. The only other fun fact is I believe RuPaul was a Club Kid. I'm pretty sure But somebody can fact check me on that. That was just the name that came up when I put it in the search engine, was like RuPaul confirming that he was in this group. At the end, we also get some promises of theme, endurance of love, burden of time, power of family. I will say the most interesting out of all three is the power of family, because while Oona is living her life out of order, she is struggling to make meaningful connections when she is this perpetual amnesiac. But Oona's mother, Madeline, is a constant throughout the novel. She shows up in every time period. No matter where Oona leaps, Madeline is always there. The book really wanted to be about the struggle of keeping a family together, and I think it pulled it off phenomenally. Oona Out of Order as a title does exactly what it needs to do, because we are quite literally experiencing Oona's life out of order. I am glad that we put Oona's first name in the title because it helps us connect to the plot. If the book was just called Out of Order, I don't think it would really feel indivisible from the story in the way that it does with Oona's name. The book cover also helps this title because I think that Oona Out of Order, or even just Out of Order, sounds like it could be a psychological thriller, and the sort of cartoon drawing of the cover really helps keep the idea that this is a little bit more lighthearted. Out of Order also has a secondary meaning, which I'm not sure the author intended or not, but when a machine is out of order, it means it's currently malfunctioning, and Oona is very much malfunctioning in that she's experiencing herself in the correct order, so there's like a double meaning to Out of Order. And as far as titles go, it's simple and direct, but most importantly, it just works. Congratulations, you've made it to intermission. Grab your snacks and beverages, get your next delivery, go to the bathroom, go pee, don't hold it in. It's bad for you. Abandon all hope, all ye who enter here. This is a critical analysis, so not only will all of this book be spoiled, it will be spoiled in great detail. If you wish to read Oona Out of Order, unburdened by spoilers, now is your time to jump ship. But if you're not necessarily bothered by going a little out of order, then get your time travel boots on and let's get started. You know, I do say, like, most of this book will be spoiled. I do want to mention that I do tend to gloss over and leave stuff out, mostly because if I covered every little detail, we would be here forever. So even, you know, if you do listen to this episode before you read the book, I do promise that there's actually stuff in the book that I'm not covering or I'm just very much glossing over. For the record, I would be starting with characterization, but I guess we do have to touch base with plot, because if I don't explain what happens, none of the other stuff is gonna make sense. What a drag. So, Oona Out of Order, despite its idea feeling very complex, has a simple plot, and the simplicity makes it shine. So on New Year's Eve, the night before Oona's birthday, she's at a party with all of her friends in the 1980s. She's got a study abroad option with her close friend, but her boyfriend wants her to take a gap year for their band where Oona is the keyboardist, which will be relevant later. But when the clock strikes midnight, she suddenly transports into 2015 in her about 50-year-old self. I believe she's 51 specifically. Oona's reaction to suddenly being a middle-aged woman is exactly how you would expect a freshly 19-year-old girl to react. It's so funny because she meets Kenzie, her 30-year-old assistant, and her reaction to him is like, I don't have friends as old as you, and he's 30 and she's 51. It's kind of hilarious because on the inside she's 19. It's really silly. Future Oona or past Oona? The Oona of the previous year has written a letter to current Oona which explains the situation of her leaping through time, which Oona has to take time to process because this is a horrifying situation to be in, but fear not, Oona's mother, Madeline, is still kicking around and is here to help Oona adjust. This is also the second story I've read within the last 6 months that make a point to acknowledge 9/11. If you're not American, 9/11 is the date the Twin Towers were collapsed by terrorists who'd taken control of several passenger planes. When Oona is playing catch-up on current events, we make mention of 9/11 and Oona and Oona's exploration into how something like that could happen. And this is totally unrelated, but in my Dungeons & Dragons game where I'm a player, we had this player character who wasn't aware of the premise statement of the entire campaign. Like, all of our player characters gathered in response to this one family being executed, and one player just made the character choice to have no idea it happened. And I turned to the DM and I was like, this is like a huge event. Like, the country has forever changed since this family's execution, right? And the DM nodded with affirmation, so I turned to the player character without missing a beat. I was like, I can't believe you missed out on fantasy 9/11. So when Oona was learning about 9/11, my reaction was just simply like, I can't believe Oona missed out on the actual 9/11. Like, what the fuck? Okay, here's the thing. Because the premise of this novel is that Oona leaps through time, this is almost like a collection of short stories in the vein of, like, How High We Go in the Dark. First, let's over-explain what the leaps actually are, because it's cool. So, Oona lives a full year from 12 o'clock midnight January 1st to 11:59 p.m. December 31st, and when it turns to midnight, she is randomly placed in another year in her life. So she starts at 19 and leaps to when she's about 50, and after that, she leaps to her early 30s, then she leaps to her 40s in 2004, and then directly into 2003, more on that later. She ends up in her late 20s, I think the novel penultimate chapter, she's in 2018, and then where she's a few years older than when she was in 2015, and then we go back to the 1980s when she's actually 19, so at the beginning when we start at when she's 18, 11:59, the last chapter is 12 o'clock midnight when she's actually 19. By the time she gets back to her body at 19, 7 years have passed. She is now 26 on the inside. I might have missed a few leaps, but I hope you see what I mean when I'm she is at the start of each year, she just hops randomly through time. The Oona of the previous year sometimes does a YouTube rewind by recapping the year for current Oona to help her assimilate easier without having to deal with the amnesiac problems, but the other times she doesn't write a letter. Since we're only getting Oona in her earlier leaps, we are constantly dealing with the amnesia problem, which is why this story feels like a series of interconnected short stories, because she has literally no idea where she is, why she's there, who she knows, and who she's dating. Who she's fucking is a major concern throughout all of these timelines. And look, I could go into deep detail about each timeline, but for the sake of time, I will only be talking about 2004 and 2003 because it's the most interesting of the timelines. But do not fret. In order to discuss the characterization of our cast, we will have to cover some of the other timelines. And this is a definitely trust the process episode. We're going a little bit out of order. So, dear reader, you might be wondering, what is so interesting about the 2004 and 2003 timeline that of all the possibilities, this is the one I'm going to go in great detail for? I'm so glad you didn't ask. Gather round, it's story time with Uncle Chris. So, when it clicked that the Oona of the previous year is communicating with the Oona of the current year, I got excited because I want to know what happens when Oona goes to the previous year of a year we've already seen her live out. She always starts the year in a random location because she's where she was at 11:59 p.m. of the previous year. So after experiencing 2004 and waking up on a subway, when we get to 2003, we know that however this story goes and however this year goes, it will end with Oona on a subway. We know the ending, and we are watching out for the events to fall into place that puts her in that spot. We get the other half of the night. And the tea, my dears, the sun is jealous of the heat. In 2004, Oona is in her 40s. She wakes up on the subway with a stranger handing her a pen saying that Oona just asked her for it. This would be Oona of 11:59 p.m. 2003. Oona clearly was trying to write a message to the next Oona, but she didn't have enough time to write it, and the woman who was offering the pen heard Oona muttering about a couple of people and only remembers the name Edward and Peter. This is all Oona has to go off of. The only other thing of note is that Oona has Dale's watch in her pocket. Dale is her boyfriend from the 80s, who is in a band with her, and the watch is a gift he gave her on her 19th birthday. Dale dies when he's around 20 years old of a medical complication, so that's why Oona has a very complicated love life across her leaps. The boyfriend she was so in love with is very dead, and there's no way to get around it. Part of these leaps is Oona trying to grieve her boyfriend, and so the watch means a lot to her. The last time she saw this watch was in 2015. She saw it on display in her music room, so she does wonder why it's in her pocket. Everything in the novel must serve a purpose, and you are not gonna believe the purpose Dale's watch being in Oona's pocket serves. It is so good. I cannot wait to get there, but we're not there yet, ladies. Take a seat. So, with this book being about time travel, we do have a few constants. One of the constants is Oona's mother. She shows up in every leap. The other is Oona's mansion. Because Oona is time hopping, she basically plays the stock market to make it rich, so money's never a problem in the story. So Oona leaves the subway, heads back to her home, where a man is waiting outside looking rather worried, and he introduces himself as Edward, Oona's husband. That's right, Lords and Germs. In 2003, Oona decided to marry someone, despite her leaping across time. The current Oona is just as shocked to learn this, but Edward insists he knows everything about her amnesia problem and has a letter from previous year Oona. Oona acknowledges that Edward is not in the 2015 timeline, and so something happens between 2004 and 2015. But the Oona from 2003 really gasses Edward up as this really good guy and asks 2004 Oona to make it work. We also know that Oona tells Edward that she has an amnesia problem and happens on midnight on December 31st, and Edward just bought it. Oona was like, I rebranded the time travel as a medical condition, and he accepted it. We love a dumb guy. Not this dumb guy. We'll learn why we don't love this dumb guy. The letter Oona wrote basically was like, no spoilers, you'll re-fall in love with Edward, it'll be great. And Edward and Oona talk out the strange situation they found themselves in. It's important to note here that Edward is very concerned about Oona's amnesia. This is the first time he's experiencing it because they just met and married in 2003. Talk about speedrunning. What is this, a Sims 4 challenge? So he's pretty skeptical about the amnesia, but Oona literally has never met this man in her life. She has no idea who he is. I would say that I'm kind of with current Oona in that marrying someone knowing that you leap through time is a bad idea, but I did say we leap from 2004 and then immediately to 2003. This isn't like an Oona many leaps into the future making a wise decision. It's literally the difference of a year. A fucking year. Like, girl, what the fuck are you doing? This isn't the first time Oona is dating someone in the previous year and having no memory of it in the current year. When she leaps from 50 to, I think, 29, she has a boyfriend, but because Oona has no idea she has a boyfriend, she sleeps with the first man she sees at this, rave party because she spent a whole year basically celibate because she was a 50-year-old single woman. That relationship falls apart because who would believe Oona if she said, I leap through time every year and I didn't know I had a boyfriend in the previous year? The classic question, is it cheating if you're an amnesiac? I don't know. Go ask Geralt of Rivia. Back to 2004. Edward is opening up a business. Oona is financing it. So she is a part of the business. And something Oona worries about in 2004 is if Edward is only with her for her money. This business is a restaurant, and it's in a terrible part of town. Edward is convinced this is an up-and-coming spot, but Oona isn't so sure. She's skeptical about it being a bad location, but Edward voit la vie en rose. He sees the world in rosy hues. All the while, there's this other woman named Francesca, who is Edward's business partner and associate, but Oona can't help feel jealous of Francesca. She's very suspicious of this woman. There's this scene where the reviews are coming in and they're really, really bad because it's a bad location, it's very expensive, people just aren't really jiving with this restaurant. Francesca tries to go in and start making plans with Edward on how to react to these reviews, but Oona steps in her way and says something to the effect of, I'm his wife and he needs his wife right now. And then she goes to talk to Edward, and while he does appreciate her comfort, he does eventually ask for Francesca, and Oona leaves the office defeated. It can be tricky to identify what's wrong here because it does seem practical that Edward would want to work with his business partner to figure out how to come back from these bad reviews. Oona is a part of the business, though. She's bankrolling it. Oona is also fairly smart with her money, so I don't know why Edward wouldn't listen to her advice. But the other problem here is that in this scene, Edward is having an emotional moment about poor reviews and a failing business. He's fully freaking out about it. Oona is right that in this moment, Edward needs his wife. This isn't about figuring out how to move past these setbacks. It's about working through these emotions. Edward shouldn't be going to people he is not close with for comfort or advice. And as far as we're aware, Francesca is just a work associate. This is the moment where Edward is at his lowest and he's asking for Francesca. That's a problem. Sure, this could just be a one-time thing, but it could also be the start or a continuation of some kind of an emotional affair. People are allowed to seek comfort in other people. I don't want you to think that just because you go to a friend instead of your partner for something, that means it's an emotional affair. We're starting to fall into the zone of emotional affair when a partner is shut out of emotional intimacy almost completely in favor of somebody else, and that's something we start to see in 2004. Edward never seems to come to Oona. He is constantly away from her, doing work, and even Francesca jokingly says that Oona is going to be a quote-unquote restaurant widow because Edward is just going to be so busy. The most Oona and Edward do occasionally is sex. Now, When one partner shuts the other from emotional intimacy, it can be hard for the one that's cut off to be emotionally intimate herself. Oona feels this disconnect from Edward, and it's making it more difficult for her to be emotionally open with him. During this, Oona decides to take guitar lessons. If you remember, in the 80s, she was a keyboardist for her boyfriend Dale's band, but she always wanted to play the guitar. Dale convinced her to be on the keys. As Oona is finding more confidence in herself and the thing that she wants, Oona makes the decision to fully abandon the keyboard and play the guitar like she always wanted. Enter Peter, the other name Oona was given on the subway by the woman who heard previous year Oona talking about Edward and Peter. Peter and Oona connect really well, and Oona and her mother Madeline have this interesting conversation of what happens when you catch feelings when you're married. Oona loves her husband, but she can't help but be infatuated with Peter. He seems to pay attention to her in the way that Edward doesn't. Oona simply doesn't know what to do with this. What's going on here is, because she and Edward are no longer emotionally intimate, because Edward has cut Oona off, Oona simply enjoying Peter's company and attention feels like cheating because Oona isn't doing these things with Edward. In all fairness, it's not because Oona is repulsed by Edward, it's because he's shutting her out. Oona also does the right thing when she feels like she's developing a crush on Peter, which is she begins to limit her guitar lessons with him. She doesn't want to have this emotional intimacy and special connection with this guy that she's not married to. She wants to have it with Edward. The problem is that Edward just isn't coming to her with anything. You might be wondering why I know in great detail how emotional affairs play out. It's because I've been a victim to one before. I remember having this fight with my ex where I told him I was just so mad that I had to keep going to my other friend to talk about my problems and feelings when I should be talking to my, at the time, boyfriend. Going to close friends for comfort and relying upon them emotionally isn't the problem. Again, the problem is when your romantic partner has fully stonewalled you from emotional intimacy in favor of going to someone else. In the case of my ex, he was always going to his girl best friend for emotional intimacy and had fully shut me out, and because I really couldn't come to him for any emotional intimacy, I would be going to friends, and I hated the fact that I had to do that. I wanted to be open with him, and I just felt cut out of the relationship. But that fight reminds me of the way that Oona is struggling with her platonic relationship with Peter in comparison to her allegedly romantic one with Edward. Oona performs a charity concert with her guitar, and Edward doesn't make it to the show. This is another red flag that Edward has occupied so much time on his restaurant, he can't manage one night to watch his wife play the guitar. But after the concert and talking with Peter, Oona realizes she just doesn't love Edward anymore and decides to divorce him. Edward tries to placate the situation mostly by talking about moving the restaurant to a better location, telling Oona she was right all along and they should, move locations. But Oona is done, and Edward is gone within the week. Part of the struggle between Oona and Edward is that Oona keeps trying to bring up that this is a bad location for the restaurant, and Edward keeps brushing her off. I would be so mad. I would be livid if after all this fighting and ignoring that now, after all of this money has gone into it, Edward's like, well, that was a bad location. Let's move. Bro, listen to your wife. It's her money. Do you think it grows on trees? I guess it technically does because Oona is time traveling and playing the stock markets, but Edward doesn't know that. Dude, respect a woman's money more? Oh my god. Anyways, the sad news is that Oona tries to ask Peter out, but Peter had started seeing someone. It's sad, but don't worry, Peter will show up again in a different leap, and he will be single. There is hope for Oona, lords and gerbs. She might just find herself a man. It was a very messy year for Oona, but she's got guitar skills now, so, that's a plus. Something else that happens in this year is that Madeline, Oona's mother, and Oona are in the aftershocks of a fight they had in 2003. Oona doesn't remember it. That's the worst part. Madeline tends to be around for Oona's birthday to help her leap, but in 2003, Madeline's on a cruise, which upsets Oona, and then Madeline asks Oona to help paint her own living room, and Madeline's clearly upset, and the two manage to patch things up. Madeline went on this cruise with her boyfriend named Nathan, but they break up by the time she gets back. Madeline doesn't like Edward, and she never explains why she doesn't like him. She simply just doesn't. The good news is, again, they managed to patch things up, and the only reason why I find it necessary to bring this fight up is because it will be important for the 2003 timeline. So, with 2004 at a close, Oona jumps to 2003. I don't think there's a YouTube recap from 2002 Oona to 2003 Oona, and that's okay, because we don't need it. Structurally, we don't need to know what happened in 2002, because the thing we're focusing on in 2003 timeline is how it contextualizes 2004. Having 2002 lore showing up here would distract us from the interesting stuff. How does Oona meet the husband we know she's going to divorce? What is the fight between Oona and Madeline? Why is Oona on the subway at midnight on New Year's Eve? Why is the watch in her pocket? Why did Oona write a letter to herself but try to write a second letter on the subway? All of these questions and more will be answered on this episode of Total Drama Island. Despite Oona knowing she's going to divorce Edward, we truly have this Oedipus level of you can't fight fate moment when Oona tries to run from Edward by going to Egypt, but he's the guy sitting next to her on the plane. He's going to Egypt to spread his mother's ashes. That's not how you pronounce any of those words. He's going to Egypt to spread his mother's ashes. And despite Oona's attempt to move seats and avoid this man, they end up having really good chemistry and end up traveling together in Egypt. They have a relationship that Oona wished they had in 2004. We're not really at this point where Edward has emotionally shut her out. So of course they get married. Madeline doesn't like Edward, which again, does not elaborate on. It's just a quote-unquote bad feeling she has. All the while, Madeline is dating this alt-right loser named Nathan, who very clearly is just with Madeline for her money so he doesn't have to work. Madeline is a very progressive mom, so this seems very backwards of her to date this man. The fight Oona and Madeline have is about Edward, and it ends up with Oona telling Madeline that she will eventually break up with Nathan. I think it's in Oona's leap to 50, like her first loop, that Madeline admits that Oona once told Madeline something about her future and it was disastrous, so Madeline won't tell Oona anything. And it's really cool to see that payoff. Setup, payoff. We get to see what Oona had told Madeline about her future. It's that she'll break up with her sleazy boyfriend Nathan. So yikes, this is not going great. Oona has concert tickets with her mom, and her mom ends up giving the ticket to Kenzie. Kenzie, if you remember, will eventually become Oona's assistant in her 50s. So Oona sees this as the moment she meets Kenzie. Kenzie, who to Oona must be some random men Madeline saw and gave a ticket to. So let's get to the drama. Oona's house gets robbed. Dale's watch and 2 of Oona's guitars are taken. All the while, Edward is trying to make his dream restaurant a reality. We see him make these plans, and on his off days, he's like gambling with his friends. Oona tries really hard to get Edward to pick a different location for the restaurant, and Edward reacts really poorly. He says something like, oh, if I don't do what you say, you're gonna pull funding, and Oona doesn't have the strength to stand her ground. She doesn't want to seem like the bad guy, even though she knows this restaurant is going to fail, so she is like, no, of course not. I'm your wife and I love you. We can pick the bad location. And she's like, well, now we know why we have this location in 2004. Although, here's the thing. Edward, I'm sure, because Edward knows both timelines, I'm sure that he fucking hates that even though Oona is amnesiac in 2004, that she has the same opinion as 2003 Oona, which is a really bad location. I'm sure that Edward must have been fuming mad. Oh, Edward's a Brit. I forgot to mention that. It's not that important. It's really interesting the way that Oona keeps trying to change the events of 2004, but she can't seem to break out of the pattern. And it's not even like fate forcing her into all of these paths. It's often Oona's own personality that leads her to make these decisions. Oona always folds. It's one of her flaws is that she kind of folds to the people that she loves in her lives. She often folds to them. So, of course, she's not going to put her foot down about the restaurant. When she was dating Dale, she folded about the guitars and played the keyboard. Anyway, so Oona begins to suspect that Edward and Francesca might be more than friends. We know that they had an emotional affair in 2004, but what about 2003? Oona looks through his phone and his stuff and finds nothing. But the New Year's party is at the restaurant, and he has a work computer. So at the party, when Edward is distracted, Oona goes into his office and looks around. She finds 2 things of interest. Dale's watch, which was taken in that robbery, and naked pictures of Francesca. Edward walks in on this. They fight, obviously. Edward claims he only slept with Francesca once after they got married, but were casual sexual partners beforehand, so he lied about them being business associates. He also owed a bunch of money from the gambling with his friends, so when Edward and Oona were out of town, he set up a robbery in which 2 of her priceless guitars were stolen. They weren't supposed to take the watch, so he got it back and was trying to figure out how to return it to Oona. Oona, at this point, has already written the letter that 2004 Oona will receive and has already handed it to Edward, the one that speaks very highly of them, because it was written before any of this happened. Edward literally says, he's like, well, your memory resets at midnight, so maybe we could just start over. And that's so fucking cruel. What a monster. Oona flees the scene, ends up on the subway, watch in her pocket, and she spends the last minutes of 2003 trying to write Oona a new letter telling her to divorce Edward and marry Peter. But midnight strikes before she can get it written down, and the only person who knows anything is the woman who Oona was trying to borrow the pen from. The 2004 timeline is contextualized as basically a psychological thriller. That's why Francesca is so smug in 2004, because she's fully cheating with Edward and getting away with it. Edward took full advantage of Oona's memory lapse to play husband, and I'm sure that he's thinking about how he only needs to make it through the year, and then her memory will go again. This is like, don't worry darling levels of fucked up, but I'm here for it. Edward truly is a monster, and I love that the author really didn't hold anything back. When Oona leaps at the end of the year, she's on vacation with her mother. Oona has leapt back in time. I think she's somewhere in her 30s. Oona's crying and upset that she failed to warn 2004 Oona about Edward's infidelity, but she hesitates to tell Madeline Edward's name. Madeline is fairly convinced it wouldn't change anything, and she even tells Oona that Madeline wouldn't interfere if she knew because it's unethical, and Oona agrees. But Madeline is not an idiot. I truly believe that when we get to 2003, Madeline meets Edward and she suspects he's the terrible guy that Oona wanted to tell Madeline the name of. And that's why Madeline doesn't like him. We also basically know from the 2003 timeline that even if Madeline knew who Edward was, Oona wasn't going to listen to Madeline anyways. When Oona leaves letters for the current Oona often ignores a lot of the warnings and does not heed most of the advice, so nothing was going to stop Oona's entanglement with Edward. And this is just two of the leaps. There is so much more depth of this story. I will get into it. I just needed to tell someone about Edward, the evilest man alive. This guy might be one of my favorite book villains. Only a woman could write a villain like this. This is so terrifying. This is so scary. He's the scariest villain, truly, because people know people like this. People know people who would do this. That's why he's so scary. The simplicity of the plot really allows characterization to shine, and I think this book's most impressive quality is the depth all the characters hold. So we're going to touch on some major characters. We've already covered the evilest man in New York City, Edward. Hate that guy. 0 stars. Let's talk about Madeline. We've touched a lot on her in the plot, but let's take a closer look. Madeline is this progressive mother. She's the kind of mom that would let you drink underage so long as it was in the house. She'd get you condoms, buy you birth control, tell you to take risks and lead an adventurous life. Oona is a shut-in, and she's very anxious about branching out because her dad fell off a boat while drunk and drowned, and Oona watched it happen. Risk terrifies Oona. I can relate to that. I, too, am terrified of board games. Anyways, Madeline is a woman of chaos who remains a constant in Oona's life as she leaps through time, but Madeline isn't perfect. As we saw, there are moments where Madeline is the worst, and part of her struggle is that some years Oona is young and naive, and other years Oona is wise and older than Madeline. It's difficult for Madeline to parent a girl who lives a life out of order, but when all is said and done, Madeline only loses her cool just a couple of times, and for the most part she's very considerate and reliable in Oona's life, which is impressive considering the circumstances. Madeline is also hilarious. She is bright colors, always got a boyfriend, tries everything from weird foods to plastic surgery. In a novel where the premise is very existentially horrifying, Madeline is the thing with feathers. She is light and sunny and brings warmth into the story. So when Madeline and Oona fight, we feel it even harder because Madeline is the thing that Oona, and as a result the reader, is clinging to for normalcy. We are upset when Madeline is upset because, like a child to their parent, we need her. I've brought up Kenzie a couple of times, but let's pull the curtain on this guy. So Kenzie is the first person we meet when Oona leaves from 19 to 50, and he introduces himself as her assistant. He is aware of her time sickness and the way that she leaps. What we learn is that Kenzie is actually Oona's son. When Oona learns that Dale is going to die, her boyfriend from the 80s, from a medical condition, Oona gets pregnant on purpose, and Kenzie is that result. We assume that the Oona that gets pregnant is an older and wiser Oona because that Oona knows she can't raise a child while her time leaping thing is occurring, so Kenzie is given to a lesbian couple that Madeline knows. The Oona that eventually learns of Kenzie's relation to her is not as wise, and she makes an attempt to connect with him without revealing that she's his mother. It's Hard because the adoption contract basically has a no contact order from Oona, which means she could get in legal trouble if she does try to interact with Kenzie. Oona's plan does fall sideways, and as a result, Kenzie learns about Oona as a teenager and is very weirded out because from his perspective, a strange woman inserted herself intentionally into his life to get to know him. Certifiably creepy. Oona is encouraged by the Oona of the previous year to find Kenzie, which tells me that Oona of the previous year is much older and wiser. I think that Oona realized she was never going to be able to stop Oona from learning about Kenzie earlier than everyone had planned. Kenzie was supposed to learn at age 18, and so she decided to help Oona find him. It made me wonder if Oona's original first meeting with Kenzie went disastrously, perhaps even different than the way that we saw it go down, which is why Oona of the previous year is guiding Oona step by step. Obviously, Oona and Kenzie manage to find peace with each other, as Kenzie is with Oona when she's in her 50s. Kenzie is God's strongest soldier for being able to process all this weirdness and still manage to remain calm about it, though it probably took years for him to come to terms with who his mother is. While Dale is technically a minor character in that he doesn't get a lot of read time, his ghost haunts the narrative. He was Oona's first love, and she cannot seem to shake the fact that he's dead of something she could never prevent. We see him in the watch he gives her, the tattoo that Oona gets, the guitars, everything. But Dale is not a perfect person either. It's easy for Oona to think of only the good parts of Dale because he's gone, but as Oona gets older, she and Madeline have a very candid conversation about some of his flaws. Oona never wanted to play the keys in the band. She wanted to be a guitarist, but Dale said no, so Oona played the keys. A lot of what Dale wanted, Oona would follow. She even changed her hair to fit what he found as more attractive. So there's some catharsis with when Oona goes back to the 80s when she's 19, and Oona stands up for herself. She doesn't want to play the keys. She loves the guitar, and while Dale resists, it opens the floor for the band to air some grievances and become stronger for it. Dale is not a monster. He's no Edward, so he's willing to see Oona's side to things. He's willing to compromise. It's just kind of shocking, because from his perspective, he had this kind of girlfriend that would fold over every little thing at 11:59, and then at midnight she had this hardened, wiser Oona that has gone through character development and is now willing to stand up and and demand the things that she wants rather than just acquiescing to the people around her. It is time, my friends, for the Oona you've all been waiting for. So Oona is her own worst enemy, despite the fact that Oona's from the other years tried to set up the current Oona for success with letters and cheat sheets. Oona does not listen to them. One letter tells her not to open it while high, and Oona ignores it, and she opens it and burns half the letter, leaving Oona completely amnesiac in the 90s. She never seems to listen. When Oona accidentally cheats on her boyfriend because she didn't know she had one, Oona is warned not to tell the boyfriend, but Oona does anyways, which is a good thing, and people should be honest when you do stuff like that. But Oona literally had no idea she was in a relationship, okay? That's, is it cheating if you're an amnesiac? I don't know. There are times, though, when Oona not listening does yield better results. The letter of 2003, Oona begs 2004 Oona to make it work with Edward, and Oona eventually just doesn't listen and divorces him because she's miserable. But we know after living through 2003 that 2004 Oona made the right decision. Oona struggles with grief throughout most of this for her life, for her friends. She can't really hold on to anyone between years because she keeps sleeping, and the only constant is Madeline and then later Kenzie. Oona learns to embrace the temporary and make most of her life she's living because according to everyone, Oona never learns why this happens to her, only how to manage it. Oona also learns some self-respect. I think 2003 Edward was a really game changer for her character. She put up with Edward, and because of the leaping, so did 2004 Oona. But coming after that, Oona really learns to stand up for herself and go after the things she wants. She learns guitar, she reconnects with her son, she convinces Dale to let her do guitar and it'll be fine for the band. She finds herself as best as she can for someone who is living their life out of order. Something that also characterizes Oona is the death of her father. The short and simple of it is that Oona's father got drunk, fell off a boat, drowned. Oona watched it happen. Now, this is never something that plays a pivotal role in the plot. It's just something that characterizes Oona. She becomes reserved and scared to explore and scared to take risks as a result. And I like this because it's simple and it also helps contribute to the theme that Oona always seems to be in a state of mourning. So the structure of this novel is similar to an interconnected set of short stories like How High We Go in the Dark or Before the Coffee Gets Cold. And that's because each section of The book is a year of Oona's life, but because it's scattered across the timeline, because she's out of order, they're all fairly isolated from each other. We started in 1980, and then we jumped to 2015. Oona is 50 on the outside, 19 on the inside. What I find fascinating about the structure is always the Oona of the previous year. Sometimes she tries to warn Oona about pitfalls, other times she doesn't leave a message for Oona at all. The Oona of the previous year does state in the first letter that Oona is not going to be able to avoid having miserable experiences, and telling her isn't going to change the fact that she's going to have bad experiences. Oona also doesn't want to spoil all of the good moments either. Oona should be able to experience the wonders of life unspoiled and survive through the hardships. The structure has set up Oona to be her own ghost in the novel, a woman that Oona is usually at odds with. The letters did confuse me for the longest time. I couldn't understand how Oona of the previous year could warn current Oona in any way, but these letters are recaps of the previous year, and if that Oona of the previous year has already lived in or around the time period current Oona is in, she'll tend to give Oona some helpful advice. I spent like an hour in the shower trying to figure out how these letters worked, and I'm really embarrassed at the simplicity of it. I was gonna come into this podcast being like, these letters don't make sense, how does it even work? But it's actually not that complicated. I am, as usual, overthinking it. The prose is really approachable. I never got lost or confused in the plot. A fairly easy read, and certainly an enjoyable one. Dialogue was good. Didn't notice anything, which is a compliment. I shouldn't be aware of the dialogue. The less I have to say, the better. An interesting part of the voice is that Oona is leaping through time. She often forgets not to be anachronistic. So in the 90s, she'll talk about Uber. In the 80s, she brings up a band that doesn't exist yet. Sometimes her slang is too early or too late for the time period. These don't happen often, and it's almost always for comedic effect. It was the right amount, and it made me laugh almost every single time. Oona's narration is generally lighthearted and charming despite the grim reality of the life she's now forced to lead. She's also trying really hard to be positive when it comes to these leaps, sort of like someone stuck in a game of improv. When she leaps, she has no context and she's just gotta make shit up and hope that nobody catches on. So atmosphere has two parts, believability and the emotional atmosphere. I want to believe the world I'm reading, and I want to feel it too. The hardest sell for this book is going to be the time travel. If we don't feel like the time travel is consistent, the whole book falls apart. And we're in luck because for the most part, I would say, yeah, the time travel stuff is consistent. At the beginning of the episode, we talked about predeterminism and free will, and how every time travel story needs to pick where they fall on the line between the two extremes. I think Oona Out of Order is much closer to predetermination, but we're not there 100%. I think that Kenzie finding Oona out as his mother happened much differently, and so that's why Oona of the previous year is basically leading Oona of the current year step by step to her son. And I would think that this happened because Oona's first attempt was horrifyingly terrible than the one we saw on page. But aside from that, Oona can never really seem to change her fate. It's not so much as the hand guiding her to a specific outcome, but Oona's own personality and flaws tend to point her in the same direction every time. She reads the letter high. She divorces Edward. Even when she tries to make an active attempt not to marry Edward, she eventually lets it happen because Oona decides she might as well enjoy the magic of the marriage before it falls apart. She knows how it ends, but she can enjoy the time when it was good. I don't think Oona can really change the outcome of any of the events in her life in any major way, but I think she can slightly alter them. I don't think Oona and Kenzie finding each other for the first time would ever go well because it had always gone badly, but there might be slight variations between Oona that knows about Kenzie and the Oona that doesn't. And while I, as the reader, don't know the exact rules of time travel, it feels like there are rules that are upheld, and that's what matters. I feel like that the time travel knows what the rules are, even if I don't specifically know them. So, several times in my script, I have both wanted to describe this book as lighthearted and existentially horrifying. The emotion in this book is intense with its implications. Every year, Oona mourns the people of the year she lived before and has to figure out how to restart her life, and this is forever. But somehow the author manages to keep a level of sunshine to the novel. Oona is funny, and she's always got something witty to say despite the situation she finds herself in. This book allows itself to have fun and be fun while also engaging in some of its more dismal and darker themes. It's kind of like seeing rain on a sunny day, is the vibe of this book. We have made it to theme, so let's talk about subject and pervasive themes of this novel. Subject themes are the topics we're discussing in conjunction with the plot, and pervasive themes are what the novel seeks to say. So let's start with the subject themes. Embrace the temporary. Something this book touches on is the embrace of the temporary. For Oona, all things must come to an end, and they end faster than she could ever anticipate. She's only has a year to live a life before she has to start over and live another. Letting go is difficult, even if holding on brings you pain. As people get older, you realize, the things you once cared about don't really matter that much anymore. It can be difficult to cope with the idea that things simply won't last, but things being temporary is a part of life that every person goes through. As someone who had to restart her life 3 times in a row between the ages of 10 and 13, it fucks you up. It made me glad that Oona has people in her life to help her through this trying time. When I got to my last school, I realized there wasn't a point in making friends in middle school because we'd all separate to go to high school, and at high school we'd all separate at college, and so on and so forth. So while part of me saw no real motivation to make long-lasting, meaningful connections, I was still trying to make friends. I just reminded myself that eventually one day would be our last, and to prepare for that. I would not say that I embraced it in the way that Oona did, though. Oona handled it much better than I did, but in all fairness, this was all happening to Oona when she was 19. I graduated high school early and started college at age 17, and I can't even remember if I said goodbye to any of my classmates. I probably did, but it wasn't this world-ending event because I knew it was coming and had already mentally prepared for it. I had prepared for it before I had even met those friends. Family bonds. Family bonds is also something diligently discussed in the book. As Oona lives her life out of order, the constant across time is Madeline and then later Kenzie, her mother and her son. Love might be in the cards for Oona, but her romantic endeavors throughout most of the book have ended in disaster because of her temporal leaping. This perpetual failure allows us to really understand how important family can be in these kind of tough times, and somehow, despite the fact that Kenzie and Madeline are related to Oona, because of the temporal displacement, it does give kind of a found family vibe, and I kind of love it. So, when it comes to the pervasive theme, Oona Out of Order is about mourning, but not just mourning the dead. It's also about mourning the things that leave, the things that every person goes through. Friend groups you thought you'd never live a day without, dating partners you thought were the one, opportunities we've missed, chances we didn't take. Oona as a character is trapped in this perpetual state of mourning. She mourns her father, then her life as a whole, since she's living it out of order. She mourns Dale and her friends. She mourns the mother she could never have been to Kenzie. She mourns Kenzie a little too. She mourns the loss of Edward in the divorce, and then she mourns the wasted year with him knowing he was cheating on her. She is in this perpetual state of processing this inescapable grief, and yet the book manages to have sunlight. Oona often cries out to her mother, "Do I ever figure this out?" And always her mother says that Oona learns to manage living her life out of order, but not to cure it. And while the supernatural element makes it seem so fantastical, this is also the general feeling of most young adults. They're thrust into a world unrecognized, not the promised land their parents told them about. We too are wondering if we ever figure it out. We too will learn how to manage it. Life is filled with loss. A part of human nature is how we process the temporary state of things we're convinced are permanent. It's different for everyone, but even more drastically for someone like Oona. It is in these dark moments where hope feels radical, when you spit at the world and say, "Fuck you, I am the thing with feathers." So, as Oona asks over and over again, is there a cure, and being told that all she does is learn to manage it, I am reminded of what it's like to live with a chronic illness. I was likely born with my chronic illness, which is abdominal and pelvic floor muscle dysfunction, which means those muscles contract and relax at incorrect times, which causes pain. While I can't speak for other cases, which is a wild thing for me to say, because up until recently, I thought I was the only one with this, because I had asked the nurse at the hospital what my condition was, and she hesitated and said there wasn't really a proper name, so she just called it abdominal and pelvic floor muscle dysfunction. Anyways, I can't speak for other cases. But for me, this condition is chronic, and it's not about curing, it's about managing the symptoms. The thing about living with the incurable is accepting that it's never going away, and finding joy and peace and love despite having the condition. And of course it's not fair. We're allowed to be angry at the cards we're being dealt. It's okay to be mad at having chronic conditions and disabilities and debilitating mental illnesses, especially when it feels like they're just getting in the way. You're allowed to cry about being a survivor while all your able-bodied counterparts seem to just thrive. But you're going to run out of steam, and you're going to run out of tears, and when that's through, when you felt all of those emotions, you're going to be able to start figuring out how to live with these things that you cannot change, how to be a person in a world that might not have been built for you. But just like Oona, who has several mental breakdowns about her situation, you're allowed to freak out about it too, if that is what you need. You know, I was 14 when doctors told me that for my own health, I should never get pregnant. Sports were out of the question. It was frustrating to feel all of these doors close around me when I hadn't even finished my first year of high school, but I managed to figure out how to make it work. You know, I had an ex that I insisted I go back to the hospital to try and cure my medical condition because my muscle dysfunction was putting a strain on our sex life. I had made peace with my condition and had learned how to live life with it and lead a fulfilling life, only to be met by someone who'd never dealt with chronic conditions, insisting that with enough doctors anything can be fixed. And it's like, I don't need to be fixed. Most importantly, I can't be fixed. Most important of all of this is that biofeedback wouldn't actually change anything, since going to the hospital was just tracking my progress to ensure I was actually responding to the treatment. Because I already know that my body responds to the treatment. I don't need to go to the hospital. I can just do it at home. I just won't have the sensors to track the progress. I have all the tools to help me. It just wasn't enough for my ex. And sometimes I wish he had the strength to walk out because of that instead of punishing me for it. But that's just what happened. That's just life. And that was the thing that I had to live through. And I lived through it and I made through it. And it wasn't fair, but I made it work. And that's the important part. And Oona made it work. And you're gonna make it work. Because fuck all those other guys. Oona Out of Order is never about the cure. No one wants to cure Oona, and no one tries. Mostly because everyone already knows that she can't be cured. Can we see, we can see how this is comparable to living with chronic or incurable illnesses. So, I think if you're just aghast at how Oona manages to live her life, it might be worthwhile to seek out voices of people with disabilities because it's the same kind of narrative. Oona says it's not fair, and it isn't, but just like me, Oona has no choice but to live through it anyways and figure out how to make peace with that. When it comes to theme, I think books do a really good job when people can find meaning in it in unexpected ways. I don't know if the author intended Oona living her life out of order to be a metaphor for living with a chronic illness, but as someone who has one, I feel it on every page of the book. I feel myself seen in the book. And that's why I find it important to highlight that despite the fact that this book has a very grim topic to discuss, it manages to be light, sunny, funny, hilarious. There is hope and joy and positivity despite the circumstances of Oona's life. A perfect way to round out our talk on theme is, of course, our little corner of theories. I want to talk about some possible theories as to how the time travel of Oona Out of Order works. The lore seems to lean towards predeterminism more than free will, but we obviously don't get a clear-cut answer as to how it actually works. But, we have a lot of data to support some theories. So the simplest one, Occam's razor, it's predetermined. We're fully 100% predetermination. There's no free will, everything has been chosen for you at inception, and there's no escape from it. This would explain why, despite how Oona tries, she cannot seem to heed any of her warnings and falls into the same patterns of the Oona of the previous year. Number 2. Oona's arrow of time has collapsed. So the arrow of time is, you guessed it, a scientific concept. The simple of it is that the arrow of time is how we understand the idea of before, during, and after. It's why we remember the past, but why we don't remember the future. The second law of thermodynamics states that in a closed system like the universe, entropy increases over time. Entropy is just chaos and randomness. Basically, atoms are all moving and trying to get into their most likely state, and that movement creates a before, during, and after. They were at this spot before, they're doing this during, and now they're at this spot after. The heat death of the universe is a theory that basically says when all atoms are at their most likely state, nothing can happen because they're all too far away to interact with each other. No interaction means no friction. No friction means no heat. No heat means no universe. This also means that there's no way to tell the difference between before, during, and after. Everything simply is. So Oona living her life out of order might be a result of her being dislodged from the arrow of time. There is no before, during, or after, no past, present, and future. Oona simply is. So it's not that all of her life's years are happening in any chronological order. She's not a part of the arrow of time. Every year has already happened, is happening, and will happen. It's all at the same time. So doing something in the past won't affect the future because there's no difference between them anymore. Oona simply is. Number 3, Oona and canon. So a musical canon is when several singers will sing the same line of music but come in at different times. It's sort of like a staggered effect. So if the line of music is, listen to me sing a song I've sung for centuries, singer 1 will start the song like a regular song, but singer 2 will start singing the exact same line, but she'll come in when singer 1 is on the word sing. So singer 1 is singing the word sing, and singer 2 is singing the word listen. Singer 3 will then come in on sing the same way that singer 2 did for singer 1. And then we've got a canon. This is definitely far harder to explain in words and much easier for you to just listen to. So if you want to listen to how a canon is, you can put in a search engine, I Like the Flowers canon. I'll put a link in the description, and so you'll kind of understand what a canon sounds like. I am so sorry for my musical teacher friends that I'm probably butchering this explanation. First we're talking about science and now music. I know, we're getting a lot of unasked lessons today, but stick with me. When we isolate all the singers in a canon, they wouldn't know that they're singing in a canon. As far as they're aware, without their fellow singers, they're just singing a song. In much the same manner, Oona is living her life in canon. She's just one of the singers. Now, in canons, especially if you listen to I Like the Flowers, you'll notice that they'll repeat the canon. They'll be repeating the lyric over and over again. It basically creates a loop, a layer effect of the loop. So for our explanation of Oona as a canon, there is no repetition of lyrics if we think of a lyric like a year for Oona. Basically, when Oona turns 19, she leaps for the first time. Then when she gets to the second leap, when she goes from 50 to, I think she goes to 29, the next Oona in canon leaps from 19 to 50, and this keeps happening. And the amount of Oonas in the canon is entirely dependent on how many years Oona lives her life out of order. Because once Oona reaches death, that Oona is no longer in the canon, and will keep going until every Oona has lived throughout every year. She has sung every line of the canon and is now on her way out. If we understand as each Oona as a separate Oona in the canon, this would allow Oona to be able to change her fate a little bit. There's a clear path being set by the first Oona, and most other Oonas will follow because they literally have the same personality, but I do think it would allow Oona to make some minor changes in her life, such as how she meets Kenzie for the first time. It would also mean that, as we get to the end of the canon, Oona might even be living a much more different life because all of the Oonas are communicating information. She might be able to slightly alter her life, and that just might be chaos theory. That's total small changes that have huge consequences later down the line. I don't know, it's fun to think about. I'm kind of torn between Oona Off the Arrow of Time and Oona Living Her Life in canon. Both of them are very interesting, and I would be hard-pressed to decide which one I think is more likely than the other. Tell me what you think is happening to Oona. I'd like to hear what other people think. When it comes to case studying Oona out of order, the thing I would look at is how the premise allows this story to almost act like a set of interconnected short stories. It's also a good way to look at the ingenuity of how time travel works. It's a very unique feature and it's very impressive. I want to play a video game with this premise desperately. The tone of the book is also something worth looking at, the way that it's grim and dark, but there's also light and hope and sunshine to it. The book takes itself with the right amount of seriousness. It's also really on point with its themes. This is a really good book to case study if you really want to see how a deeply complicated family could be portrayed, which most families in real life tend to be. Art is subjective, and asserting objectivity onto art is simply a waste of time. I think we all want to read good books, we just have different ideas of what a good book is. So whether you loved Oona Out of Order or hated it, I'd love to know in the comments what you think. That is all for today. The madness is ended, and you, my friends, can go in peace.